There is no denying that as the world's second largest economy, China's global economic influence is significant. But our next guest argues that China's impact on the world reaches far beyond the economic realm and can be better understood through the history of civilization. Martin Jacques is a senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. He's also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. His global bestseller, When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order, was first published back in 2009. Since that time, it has been translated into 14 languages and sold more than 250,000 copies. He joins us now from Beijing with further insight on China's relationship with the United States and the rest of the Western world, and he'll explain why that relationship needs to be put into cultural and ideological frameworks. Martin, thanks so much for joining us here on Full Frame.
My pleasure.
Well, your book came out, and what was interesting, I think, for a lot of people who read it was that you didn't just focus on the economic strength of China. You also talked about the cultural aspects and the political influence that China can exert or change in terms of altering the world order in a sense. How have you seen that play out since your book was first published?
Well, I think that actually since the publication of the first edition 6 years ago, it's this argument in a sense has reached fruition. And that now China has acquired the kind of economic power that it has, which is, at least in terms of GDP measured by PPP, China is now larger than the United States. So economically, although it's not nearly as advanced, it's a very strong economic power. The economic strength creates, as it were, the foundation for the exercise of growing political power, diplomatic power, intellectual influence, cultural influence, and even military influence. And you can see this happening with China. Now, because China has acquired is the major trading partner of virtually all, not quite all, but nearly all the countries in East Asia, then there's a tremendous thirst in the region to learn Mandarin. Mandarin is seen as the language by which, particularly young, ambitious professionals can advance their situation because the trading links are so important. Chinese companies are becoming more important, and so on. So that's a linguistic expression of China's growing strength. Likewise, more and more students in this region are going to Chinese universities. I'm at the moment based at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and there's a lot of international students there, and in particular, a lot of Koreans, for example. Likewise, there's a lot of Korean professionals who now work in Beijing. So what's happening is, if you've got a big economy, it exercises a gravitational pull, if you like, on people for employment, on people because they're influenced, they want to know more about it, and so on.
When I was in China a couple of years back, a couple of young guys from the U.S., one had gone to Harvard and another one George Washington University. They're in their 20s, and they said, this is the place to be. I mean, you must be hearing a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, when I was working on the book, it was beginning, but it was, much less apparent then than it is now. There's people, the people are attracted by this. China still, even though the growth rate is obviously lower than it was, but 7% isn't bad, is it? Compared with about 2.1% at the moment for the US. So the Chinese economy is still growing. So this is a country which is expanding, if you like, expanding within itself and also expanding externally, mainly economically, but also in these other ways as well, the political, the cultural, and so on. Now, in that sense, China's a very, very interesting place to be because it's remaking itself. It's been remaking itself for quite a period now. And meanwhile, because it's achieved a certain level of development, it is remaking the world. I mean, China is, I think, the most dynamic force in the world today, more dynamic than the United States, because by and large, you can understand the American position. The American position is that it's achieved a certain, great status in the world and so on. It's created many of the most important institutions in the world in terms of governance and so on. So, America's a more I mean, in that sense, more staid and more status quo and a bit more defensive, whereas China is, got all the ambitions of a teenager.
Martin, you say that we're living in an era of contested modernity. What does that mean exactly?
Well, this is, I think, a very important question. You see, hitherto, I think, by and large, Western societies thought that at the end of the day, everyone would be like us. That there is only one way of being modern, and it's our way of being modern. Modernity is singular, it is Western modernity. So whether you're Japan, or whether you're China, or whether you're Brazil, you're going to end up like us. Now, this for up to a point was not a totally unreasonable proposition, because until the mid-20th century, really the only successful countries, bar Japan, that had managed to industrialize, modernize, were Western countries. But since the Second World War, especially from around about the late 1950s, 60s, of course that picture began to change profoundly as modernization took root in lots of different countries, starting in particular with the Asian tigers, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, later other countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and of course, crucially, China. And the nature of these, there's a view in the West that somehow modernity is simply a product of competition and markets and technology. That's not true. It's also shaped very profoundly by history and culture.
So, Martin, give me an idea. What's the difference then between Chinese modernity versus a Western modernity?
Well, Chinese modernity will be a hybrid. It's going to be, it's learnt from the West, it's learnt from other East Asian countries, but it's also rooted in, as it were, the soil of China. So it has inevitably shaped very powerfully by the historical characteristics of China, which is why, we find it difficult to understand, but expectations of governments and the exercise of governance in China is very different. The state is much stronger, and it's expected to be strong, and it's recognized that it's right to be strong.
And you were saying earlier, and I want to go back to this point, that it's only been recently that it's been kind of viewed as a traditional nation state. Before that, pretty much, and even today, civilization state is more the term you like for China. Can you explain the difference and why that's so important?
Yeah, I mean, well, the way in which people see themselves is not simply a product. I mean, China's really only been a nation state since the late 19th century, early 20th century, which is, in historical terms, is an extremely short period in the history of China. So the characteristics which shape China are not the characteristics of the last 120 years. They are of the last 2,000 years or longer. Now, what am I talking about here? Confucian values, this very distinctive relationship between the state and society, very different and distinctive notion of the family. The word the Chinese like to use, guanxi. Guanxi is about relationships, which are very important in China. So it's much more, whereas the United States is a rule-based society and you have a few million lawyers and all that kind of thing, in China it's much more a relationship-based society. Or even the language. If you look at the language is very, it's a very old language, one of the earliest written languages, and it's very distinctive because actually there are, in a sense, many different languages spoken in China, which they call dialects, but they're, someone speaking Cantonese can't understand someone who's speaking Mandarin. But the written script, the characters are shared characters. So although the spoken language often is very diverse, the actual written language is common across China. Or take, Chinese food or chopsticks or traditional Chinese medicine. All these things which really profoundly shape what China is, what the Chinese feel about themselves, who they think they are, comes not from the recent period of being a nation state, but the much longer period of being a civilization state.
Martin, one of the questions I want to ask you is, China, you said relationship-based, and China's relationship with the developing world is very different from the way it's relating to the West. And we think of the African continent where China has a rather large footprint now. How has that altered the worldview, and how is that altering things? And why the importance on the developing world, do you think?
Well, I think China's problems have been those of a developing country. Therefore, it has a great insight into the problem of developing countries. It is, bar none, easily the most successful example of a developing country in the last 30, 40 years of global history, without any doubt whatsoever. I mean, no other country's grown, at 10% a year for more or less every year for 35 years and achieved these kind of economic results. I mean, there's no other developing country which, has suddenly arrived with a huge population, arrived on the global scene with the kind of influence and footprint that China has got. Therefore, I think it feels a strong affinity with other developing countries. And I think it has, because of this, also a great insight into what the problems of a developing country are. And, China's emphasis is on the crucial importance of economic growth, crucial importance of investment, crucial importance of infrastructure. And in a way, what the Chinese offer is to these societies is exactly that, that we can help you develop. And of course, the biggest single factor probably in Africa's progress in the last 10 years, or 15 years even, has been the arrival of China and Chinese trade and Chinese investment and Chinese know-how. It's been very important in Africa's development, but not only in Africa. You can see this in other countries as well, like in other parts of the world, like Latin America. And I think you're going to see it really profoundly in the next 10 years or so in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, that area, Afghanistan. I mean, I think that the Chinese will probably, bring development to these societies. Now, the Western record is much worse. And I think this is a complicated question, but one of the reasons why the Western record is much worse is because they're developed societies, and in some profound way they don't really understand developing societies. I mean, in the West we're very happy to lecture them, but I don't think the lectures are very effective because we just don't get it in a way. We don't know what they need. The Chinese do know what they need.
What are the consequences on both sides from this kind of looking at China solely through the Western prism?
Well, we don't understand it. It's as simple as that. If you only look at China through a Western prism, you can't make sense of China. We don't understand, because we don't try and understand China in its own terms, but we try and see China always through our own lens, then, that's why we get it wrong. I mean, what this means is that we project onto China our own agenda, our own priorities, our own way of seeing the world. So if you have a discussion on China, very quickly, if it's from a Western point of view, it's about human rights. Or it's about the overweening powers of the state, or something like that. Now, I'm not saying I'm a Western, I'm not saying human rights don't matter, but the way the Chinese view the question would be rather different. They would say, well, look, we've taken 600 million people out of poverty over the last 35 years, and this is by a way the largest proportion of people globally that have been taken out of poverty. And if people want to, the basic foundation stone for people having human rights is the right to eat, the right to be able to live and have a decent, an escape from poverty. And in that sense, I would say, well, the Chinese have probably made a bigger contribution to human rights globally, given that they've got 20% of the world's population, than anyone else. Now, so we don't talk the language and the conceptual approach, well, they don't connect up, because we're thinking of this guy who's been imprisoned, or this writer that's been incarcerated, and why should he be incarcerated? Because he's just expressing his own views. And so that's the way we come at it, and the Chinese come at it in a different way.
Martin?
Now, I think, broadly speaking, in that argument, I mean, both sides have got, of course, a strong claim to be right from different positions. But I think, given the developmental picture, the Chinese are more right than the West.
Martin, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for such a lively discussion. It's been great to have you on the broadcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with a look at one of the most important opportunities for cooperation between the United States and China, a collective effort to save the planet.